Welcome to Minnesota Law Now. I'm William McGeveran, a Dean and William S. Patty Professor of Law here at the University of Minnesota Law School. Today we're talking about the SAVE Act currently pending in Congress. What it could mean not just for voting rights, but for participation in American life more broadly. I'm joined by two of my brilliant Minnesota law colleagues. Professor Jill Hasday is a distinguished McKnight University professor and Centennial professor of law. She's a leading scholar of constitutional law and anti-discrimination law. Charlotte Garden is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and the Gray, Plant, Mooty, and Bennett Professor of Law here at Minnesota Law. She's a preeminent scholar in labor and employment law. Jill, Charlotte, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So I want to start with a basic understanding of what the SAVE Act is and what it would do. Charlotte, maybe you can just start us off with some explanation.
Yeah, sure. So there have been a few different versions of this legislation floating around. There's one that passed the House. It has kind of four main parts. One, and this is maybe the one that people have heard about the most, has to do with voter registration. It requires what the statute calls documentary proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. That has to be presented in person. And it means, for most people, either a passport, which lots of people don't have, or a photo ID plus a birth certificate, which also lots of people don't have. Second, there's a voter ID requirement. It's a very strict one. It's stricter than any voter ID requirement in any state except, I think, one. It would require voters to produce a valid driver's license or a non-driver ID issued by the DMV, a passport, a military ID, and certain tribal IDs. So note that there are many forms of ID that people commonly have that are not on that list, including student IDs. If you vote by mail, which I used to do in Washington State, right? Some states have almost entirely vote by mail. You have to include a photocopy of your qualifying ID. Third, there is a kind of state and federal information sharing provision. It requires states to send their voter rolls to the federal government in order to have them checked for potential non-citizens. And so that will lead to kind of periodic purges of voter rolls. And then there are criminal penalties for election officials who allow voter registration without the qualifying documentary proof of citizenship. So a lot going on there. Each one of those is tremendously significant.
So, Jill, what problem do the proponents of this law say they're trying to solve?
This legislation is aimed at a problem that doesn't exist. The theoretical problem is non-citizens attempting to vote in U.S. elections, but every study that's ever been done suggests that that is a vanishingly rare phenomenon. For instance, there was this 2016 study. They asked electors in 12 states covering 23.5 million votes. How many incidents did you have of non-citizens attempting to vote? There were 30 incidents, which is 0.001%. And I'll just say many of those incidents, maybe even most of them, the person is confused. It's an election. They think they can vote and they don't realize. It's not like some malicious plot.
Yeah. It raises all kinds of issues. We're going to try and go through a bunch of them. I wanted to start, though, with the constitutional stakes. So, Jill, you've talked in other places about some of the core constitutional concerns that you believe the legislation raises. What stand out to you as the biggest sort of potential constitutional problems here?
Unfortunately, as the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution, the arguments aren't as strong as they might be. Mm-hmm. I actually want to start in 1875 with a case called Minor v. Happersett. Virginia Minor was the head of women's suffrage in Missouri. And after the 14th Amendment was a bitter disappointment for women suffragists, they had hoped to be enfranchised explicitly. They weren't. Virginia Minor and other suffragists come up with this new idea, which is they claim we're citizens. One of the inherent rights of U.S. citizenship is the right to vote. They go to the Supreme Court. Her husband is her lawyer. He's also a feminist, so it's kind of also a feminist marriage story. And the Supreme Court agrees that women are citizens, so okay, that's something, but say there's no right to vote inherent in citizenship. Minor v. Happersett, which is entangled in anti-suffragist reasoning, remains the law to this day. There is no affirmative right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. There are certain reasons for disenfranchisement, which are unconstitutional, like the 15th Amendment prohibits race-based disenfranchisement, the 19th Amendment prohibits sex-based disenfranchisement, but there's not an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution, which I think many people are surprised to learn.
Sure. So when you look at the kind of constitutional issues that you could raise about this bill, I mean, we've talked a little bit about equal protection kind of concerns. Do you see equal protection concerns in the SAVE Act?
I have enormous equal protection concerns about the SAVE Act. It would disproportionately disenfranchise women and people of color. Unfortunately, the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the 14th Amendment makes it very hard to pursue those claims in court. The Supreme Court has interpreted the constitutional guarantee of equality very narrowly to really focus on statutes that explicitly distinguish based on race or sex or some protected class. If a law is facially neutral, as this law is, it never uses the word sex or race. Sure. The court says we'll only apply some heightened level of scrutiny if you can show the law was passed basically because of animus, not simply in spite of, but in part because of its adverse effects. Realistically, it is very hard to get that kind of documentary evidence of malice. So the court would apply a very low level of scrutiny, which is called rational basis review. Basically, could any legislature think this was reasonable? Yeah, they're really concerned about those 30 out of 12 million cases, so it's harder to challenge it constitutionally than you would think.
Sure. So as is often the case, the difference between the intent requirement and the effect requirement makes a huge difference in a constitutional argument.
Yes, I think this legislation is a huge and powerful example of the downsides of the court's narrow focus on explicitly sex-based or race-based legislation and decision to essentially ignore facially neutral action.
Well, let's move to that point exactly now, because among the groups that could potentially be disproportionately affected by these requirements, as you said, are women. Maybe you can start off by explaining a little bit about why that would be the case.
So as Charlotte discussed, there's a variety of ways you can establish your citizenship. Some people have a passport. Some people have an expensive and special kind of driver's license that confers U.S. citizenship. But your ordinary driver's license is not sufficient. You have to supplement an ordinary driver's license with some other proof. So for instance, you could supplement it under the statute with a certified birth certificate. First thing I'll say, it has to be certified, like with a stamp on it. But also the name on the birth certificate has to match the name on your driver's license. So there was a recent survey, 2023, 80% of women in different sex marriages take their husband's name. An additional 5% hyphenate, meaning 85% of married women don't have birth certificates that match their driver's license. So that whole route to establishing citizen is just not available disproportionately to women.
So you've talked about how many women don't have driver's licenses and birth certificates that match. More broadly, what kinds of scale are we talking about women and others lacking the right documentation to satisfy those requirements?
There was a national survey that found 9.1% of U.S. citizens of voting age, which translates into 21.3 million people, lack ready access to one of the documents that's required. At least 3.8 million people simply don't have those there's no way to get those documents. So this statute would effectively disenfranchise millions of Americans.
And I guess the follow-up question is, there are probably patterns in the kinds of people who find themselves in those situations.
Yes. So for instance, the same survey found that 11% of American citizens of color would be unable to find these documents. For white Americans, in contrast, the figure was 8%. I mean, one immediate way to think about it is about half of Americans have passports. They're disproportionately wealthy. Passports are expensive, and you usually get them because you're going on an international trip, which costs a lot of money.
Sure. So we've been talking about voting, which is the asserted goal of the SAVE Act, but that's not the only place where documentation matters. How do you see the narratives here overlapping with your area of specialty, work law and employment law?
Yeah, so, I mean, one big picture answer is that the the same narratives are at work here as are at work when people claim that immigration hurts U.S. workers, right? In both situations, we are seeing similar kind of scapegoating of immigrants for social problems, including like just imaginary social problems. I mean, that is the thing with the SAVE Act, especially. Mm-hmm. So in the work context, you've probably heard people make the claim that, Americans would get paid more if immigrants weren't competing for jobs. That is not true. But it doesn't mean that can't sort of sound convincing or convince people in the moment to support sort of anti-immigration policies. Another parallel is sort of the deployment of that narrative as a purported justification for other policy initiatives, things like revoking work authorizations or making it harder for universities to admit non-U.S. students. Small scale, there is also just this sort of really direct parallel that asks what should have to happen for somebody to prove authorization to do something, right, to work or to vote. In the employment context, that often looks like a policy debate about whether employers should have to use a system called E-Verify, in addition to the normal document check that you've probably done when you started a job, where you fill out an I-9 and your employer photocopies your documents. About half of states require E-Verify for some or all employers. In the Trump administration, we're seeing a push both to mandate that more employers use E-Verify, but also the same administration claiming that E-Verify isn't very accurate and there is still this problem with people working without authorization. Note the tension. So in the Trump administration, we are seeing both a push to have employers use E-Verify, but also claims that E-Verify isn't effective and that there are big problems with non-authorized workers working. The tension there obviously is something that is sort of being used to ratchet up the pressure on or a push towards a more restrictive immigration policy.
And I wonder how the documentary requirements in the SAVE Act compare to those that exist in work law, both the papers you have to bring and then the possibility of using this E-Verify database afterwards.
I mean, the SAVE Act is much stricter than what is required in the workplace context, among other reasons. There are lots of non-citizens who are authorized to work in the U.S.
Right.
The SAVE Act the SAVE Act imposes just a really, really significant hurdle in terms of the restrictions on the specific kinds of documents you can use.
So we've talked about the participation in civic life that comes with the ability to vote and the ways it might be restricted. Those kinds of requirements sound like they would restrain participation in economic life. What kind of broader economic consequences do those kinds of issues raise in the economy, as we were talking about in the democracy?
Well, I would say that the economic realm and the democratic realm are really closely linked here. Mm-hmm. So one likelihood, and one thing I think we're already seeing, is that the Trump administration's crackdown on immigration is making immigrant workers fearful, right? Afraid to kind of poke their head up, both because of both because of just for unauthorized workers, the possibility of immigration enforcement, and even for authorized workers, the possibility that the administration will revoke their authorizations. So we've seen that in the context of the administration's what is often called the ideological deportation policy, where workers have their work authorization revoked because of something they've expressed on social media that the administration disagrees with. Likewise, the kind of just possibility of maybe reasonless revocation of work authorization for individual workers or groups of workers. So, given all that, you can understand why somebody would be afraid to say, sure. I am being paid less than the minimum wage, which is an absolutely rampant problem, especially among employers of unauthorized immigrants. But also, I am, is an immigrant worker, whether authorized or not, going to be willing to join a union or to work collectively with their colleagues to solve some kind of workplace problem if they are afraid that their employer will call, immigration enforcement and try to have their work authorization revoked or try to have them deported. So there's a really direct link there, I think, between economic and civic life. Sometimes people call unions schools of democracy, right? It's really common for workers who are active in their unions to go on to be active in U.S. political life in other ways. So there's a real cost there that really straddles the economy and our broader participatory democracy.
Right. And I want to underscore and clarify one thing that's latent in your answer there. So you might think of this as a binary. You either are authorized to work in the U.S. or you're not authorized to work in the U.S. And I think an important part of what you're saying is there's lots of people who have authorization to work in the U.S., but that is insecure or is contingent in certain ways. So the chilling effect that you're talking about really would affect lots of people who are otherwise currently authorized to work, wouldn't it? Exactly.
Yes. Right. The fear is, if I come to the attention of the authorities, they'll try to revoke my work authorization.
Right. And it just goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. This is obviously going to affect immigrants, which is also going to have a disproportionate racial and national origin effect in various ways.
Absolutely.
Well, when you look at all of this workforce participation issue that you're talking about, that could also have some economic ramifications, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So the notion that immigration is bad for U.S. workers just isn't borne out. So I'm not a labor economist, but I follow a bunch of them on social media, I guess. Next best thing. And they sort of broadly agree that immigration grows the economy, that it does not meaningfully harm the wages of U.S. workers, that immigrants hold up the childcare and home health sectors, which have a host of important ripple effects for both immigrant and U.S. citizen workers. And immigrants help revitalize kind of stagnant or declining towns and cities. In particular, since we're in Minnesota, Operation Metro Surge was very bad for our economy here in the Twin Cities, right? So there is a recent report from North Star Policy Action estimates $106 million in lost wages in the Twin Cities alone. And think about the ripple effects that has, right? That $106 million in lost wages didn't then get circulated in the economy as workers bought things, right? Bought groceries or bought restaurant meals or paid their rent. I mean, that's
right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, workers who aren't being paid or not spending, and people who are depending on daycare or elder care to be able to go work themselves can't if it's not available.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And I mean, first and foremost, Operation Metro Surge was a moral travesty, but also the economic effects are real and ongoing.
I don't suppose there's any constitutional argument there either, huh, Jill?
Well, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has interpreted immigration law to give Congress what they call plenary authority over immigration. So even actually like an explicitly racist immigration law, the Supreme Court has never gone back and said that is unconstitutional. And I feel like that has long been a simmering problem in American constitutional law, and maybe it's come to the forefront a little more at this moment. So that's one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is a lot of immigration enforcement, at least, is in the form of facial neutrality. So even if the court was more interested in challenging the constitutionality of immigration rules, if it keeps its lock on explicit, say, race discrimination, that's often not in the language of the statute.
Sure. Do you have any sense of, assuming that the SAVE Act were to pass, which, it's unclear whether it can right now, but if it did pass, would you anticipate, notwithstanding the obstacles, that there would be legal challenges to it?
Oh, I mean, I'm sure there are going to be legal challenges. I mean, it's possible, even under the Supreme Court's kind of stilted view of the equal protection argument, it's possible to argue that it was motivated by animus. I suspect the response will be it was motivated by this concern with voter fraud or even with a concern for partisan advantage. And the Supreme Court has said in a number of voting cases, well, if you were just trying to kind of like win for your party, that's okay, because that's not race discrimination. One of the ironies of the SAVE Act is that Republicans are mainly pushing it. It's actually not clear that it would disproportionately benefit Republicans. So time will tell. And there are some Republican opponents in Congress, I think, that are very focused on. It's not actually clear who's going to have the advantage.
Yeah, because we've talked about women and we've talked about immigrants, but another population sometimes indicated as having difficulties with these kinds of documentation requirements are older people, right?
Older people. And also there's a huge class bias, which the Supreme Court is not interested in constitutionally. But clearly, when you think about who has a passport, who has ready access to these, a lot of that is about having financial and just kind of like human capital resources to negotiate the bureaucracy and to have the time to do it.
Go ahead.
And rural voters as well, right? So Lisa Murkowski has been publicly opposing the SAVE Act because for many Alaskans, they'll have to fly in order to be able to register to vote, right? To be able to present their documents in person.
Right, because of how far flung Alaska is, and there's places that don't have any roads at all. Yeah. So both, and the voting by mail has an effect disproportionately on certain kinds of voters, and rural and older voters might be some of those. Okay. So we've talked about economic participation, we've talked about the immigration ramifications, and we've talked about the gender ramifications of these kinds of documentary requirements, whether in the SAVE Act or in other laws. In some ways, this is about who belongs in the American polity, I suppose. And how do you think about this question against some of the larger questions of discrimination and participation that each of you studies? Is this of a piece with lots of other things you see? Is this a departure in a more challenging direction?
To me, one of the strains of American history is we have a long history of conflicts over voting and voter suppression, and this is very much of a piece. I think America does have a voting problem, but our main voting problem is not enough citizens vote. In the last presidential election, only 73.6% of the voting age population was registered, only 65.3% voted. So to me, it's very much of a piece. There's a long history of voter suppression, but it goes in exactly the wrong direction. To the extent we want to change voting laws, it should be trying to get that number up to 100%. So every U.S. citizen votes.
How about you, Charlotte?
Yeah, I think we are at a moment of intense backlash politics against the idea of America as an inclusive democracy. Mm-hmm. And the push for the SAVE Act is a particularly acute, I guess, instance of that backlash politics.
So when you think about this, where's the path to the future for people who, like you, have a lot of concerns about these kinds of policy interventions around identification, documentation, identity, belonging? Where's the energy for the future to respond to what you're describing, Charlotte, as backlash politics?
Well, I mean, I think there has been quite a bit of resistance to the SAVE Act. And what I'd like to say is the way to be certain you're going to lose is to give up. So the only thing to do is to keep pushing. I think there's been quite a bit of pushback to the SAVE Act, and it's been pretty effective so far in getting the message out. This is not a technical amendment, but this is really about disenfranchising literally millions of U.S. citizens.
What do you think, Charlotte?
I was going to say something very similar, right? That when people learn what the SAVE Act does, they mostly hate it. And that seems to be a silver lining here, right? Mm-hmm. Like when you ask people a question that sort of sounds in, do you believe in democracy? Do you believe that people who are eligible to vote should be able to vote? They mostly think the answer is yes. Mm-hmm.
Which has two potential implications. One is the SAVE Act might not pass. It does not seem to have the votes as of now. And number two, it might be the seeds of some of the future thinking about democracy that both of you would hope for.
I certainly hope that people, if they don't like the SAVE Act, not only do they call their congressman, but what a good reason to vote this year, right?
That'll show them.
That'll show them.
So I just want to step back and do what we often do at the end of these episodes so far, and just sort of ask people to synthesize what we've been talking about as kind of one big picture point. As you look at the SAVE Act itself in particular, but also all the broad implications we've teased out about discrimination, about belonging, about the way that what this says about our politics now. If we were going to have our listeners walk away with one big thought, what do you think you'd have them walk away with?
The most important issue facing us today is whether we commit ourselves to being an inclusive interracial democracy or whether we turn away from that vision of America.
Well, it's clear that the SAVE Act raises fundamental questions that go well beyond its borders, well beyond voting, about what it takes to be recognized and included in the American society. So I want to thank my extraordinary colleagues, Jill Hasday and Charlotte Garden. And I appreciate you both being here. And thanks to you for listening to Minnesota Law Now.
Thank you.
Thank you.